Welcome back to SFT Horror Vault, where we unlock the darkest secrets that history tried to bury. I'm your host, and tonight we're opening the vault on 7 deeply disturbing cases from the Pacific Northwest. Stories that will make you question what really lurks in those misty forests and isolated coastlines. What you're about to hear are not campfire tales or urban legends. These are documented accounts from real people who encountered something inexplicable in a region where the line between our world and something else grows disturbingly thin. Each case has been reconstructed from first-hand testimonies, sealed records, and investigations that were quietly filed away when they raised too many uncomfortable questions. The Pacific Northwest, with its ancient forests, endless fog, and communities clinging to the edge of civilization, has always been a place where mysteries thrive. Some say the region's dark history seeps into the land itself. Others believe something far older than human memory still watches from those treeline shadows. If you're drawn to horror that goes beyond jump scares, if you want stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark, if subscribe to SFT Horror Vault and hit that notification bell. We're just getting started. And trust me, you don't want to miss what we're unlocking next. Drop your own Pacific Northwest experiences in the comments below. I read every single one. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's unlock the vault. Tonight, we're diving deep into the darkness that dwells beneath the evergreen canopy and within the fog-shrouded shores of America's most haunted region. Harold Whitmore had worked as a park ranger in North Cascades National Park for 23 years. By October 1987, he thought he'd seen everything these mountains could throw at him. He wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense. His job was simple: keep hikers safe, know the weather, and respond when people got into trouble. Over 2 decades, Harold had pulled injured hikers off dangerous slopes and guided countless lost tourists back to safety. He was good at his job. He trusted his experience. That was about to change. The call came in on a Friday afternoon, just after 3 p.m. Harold was wrapping up paperwork when dispatch told him a family hadn't returned from their hike. The Hendersons, Robert, 42, his wife Patricia, 39, and their teenage daughter Jennifer, 16, had checked in that morning for what should have been an easy day hike on the Cascade Pass Trail. Robert had been excited, telling Harold they were celebrating Jennifer's 16th birthday with a camping weekend. They planned to hike to Cascade Pass, take some photos, and get back to their campsite before dark. When sunset came and went with no sign of them, and their tent sat empty at the campground, someone called it in. Harold assembled a search team right away. The weather forecast wasn't good. An early winter storm was rolling in from the Pacific. Temperature had already dropped 15 degrees since morning. Thick clouds were gathering over the peaks. If the Hendersons were hurt or lost up there, they'd be facing a deadly night in rapidly deteriorating conditions. Harold grabbed 5 experienced rangers, loaded them up with medical supplies, powerful flashlights, and radios, then headed up the trail as daylight faded. The Cascade Pass Trail was one of the park's most popular routes, a 7.5-mile round trip that climbed 2,800 feet through dense forest before breaking into alpine meadows with spectacular mountain views. Harold knew every inch of this trail. He'd hiked it hundreds of times. As the search team climbed through the darkening forest, calling out the Henderson family's names, Harold felt something he couldn't quite explain. An unease he'd never experienced before on these mountains. The forest seemed too quiet. No birds. Even the wind through the trees sounded wrong, hollow and mournful. They searched all night. Temperature kept dropping. By midnight, Harold's breath came out in clouds, and light snow had started falling. The fresh powder covered the trail, erasing any footprints the family might have left. Harold split his team into pairs, assigning each a section of trail to search while staying in radio contact. He took the upper section himself, climbing toward Cascade Pass as snow fell harder around him. It was nearly 3 a.m. when one of the search teams radioed with news. They found something near the 4-mile marker, a backpack partially hidden under an overhanging rock. Harold rushed to their location, hope surging. Maybe the Hendersons had taken shelter nearby. Maybe they were just waiting out the storm. When Harold examined the backpack with his flashlight, that hope turned into something cold and heavy in his gut. The pack was blue, relatively new, and definitely belonged to the Hendersons. Inside, Robert's wallet with his driver's license and credit cards, some granola bars, a half-empty water bottle, and a camera, a Canon M1 with a telephoto lens. What disturbed Harold wasn't what was in the pack, but where they'd found it. The backpack was sitting upright against the rock face, carefully positioned, not dropped or abandoned in panic. The zipper was closed. Everything inside was neatly organized. Someone had placed it there deliberately, wanting it to be found. Harold's skin prickled despite the cold. He carefully removed the camera and checked it. The film counter showed 23 out of 36 exposures used. Whatever happened to the Henderson family might be documented on that roll of film. The search continued through Saturday and into Sunday. The storm got worse, dumping 8 inches of snow at higher elevations. Harold called in more people and equipment. A Coast Guard helicopter with thermal imaging cameras scanned the mountainside for body heat. Search dogs tracked the family's scent from their campsite. Local news picked up the story. Soon Harold was managing not just a search operation, but dozens of volunteers who showed up wanting to help. The Hendersons' relatives drove in from Seattle, desperate and terrified, begging Harold to do everything possible to bring their family home. On the 3rd day, a dog handler made a discovery that made Harold sick to his stomach. Near the edge of a steep cliff, about half a mile past where they'd found the backpack, the dogs located several items clearly belonging to the Hendersons. Patricia's red fleece jacket, Robert's Seattle Mariners baseball cap, and Jennifer's birthday necklace. A delicate silver chain with a small heart pendant her parents had given her that morning. The items were scattered near the cliff edge, like they'd been deliberately removed and left behind. The cliff dropped nearly 200 feet into a rocky gorge below, where a narrow stream cut through moss-covered boulders and ice. Harold organized a technical team to rappel down into the gorge. If the Hendersons had fallen, their bodies would be down there somewhere. The team spent hours searching every crack and hollow. They found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no sign anyone had fallen or been injured there. It was like the Henderson family had simply removed their belongings, left them at the cliff edge, and vanished into thin air. Harold had never seen anything like this in his entire career. People don't just disappear without leaving some trace, some evidence of what happened. The film from the camera was developed Monday morning at a photo lab in nearby Marble Mount. Harold sat alone in a small room at the ranger station, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand as he slowly went through the stack of photographs. The first images were exactly what he expected. The Hendersons documenting their drive to the park, their arrival at the campground. Jennifer smiling, holding up a birthday cake with 16 candles. Photos of the trail, morning sun through tall trees. Patricia pointing at wildflowers. Robert photographing a deer near the 2-mile marker. Jennifer taking selfies with mountains in the background. Then the photographs changed. Image 14 showed the family stopped on the trail, arms around each other, smiling. Behind them, barely visible between 2 large cedar trees, was the shape of a person. Too far away and too obscured by shadow to see clearly, but definitely someone watching them from the forest. Harold's pulse quickened as he moved to the next photo. Image 15 showed Patricia and Jennifer together, both smiling while Robert took the shot. The figure in the background had moved closer, now standing at the edge of the trail, maybe 50 feet behind them. Still too distant to see details, but definitely human-shaped, wearing dark clothing. Harold's hands shook as he continued. With each image, the mysterious figure drew nearer to the Henderson family. In photo 18, only about 30 feet separated them, though the family still seemed completely unaware of being followed. Harold could make out more details now. A tall, thin person in dark clothes that seemed wrong for the weather and terrain. Something about the figure's posture looked unnatural, like someone moving in ways human joints shouldn't move. In photo 20, the figure had closed to maybe 15 feet. Robert had photographed Jennifer pointing at something off the trail, her face bright with excitement. The figure stood directly in the center of the frame, behind her, closer than seemed possible given the time between shots. Then Harold reached photograph 23, the final image on the roll, and his blood ran cold. This photo showed all three Hendersons posing together. Someone else must have taken this picture, someone who'd offered to capture a family moment on Jennifer's birthday. They stood close together, smiling, with beautiful alpine landscape behind them. And standing directly behind the family, close enough to touch them, was the figure that had been following them through the forest. For the first time, Harold could see it clearly. Except there was no face. Where the head should have been was only smooth, pale skin stretched tight over bone, featureless, blank. The figure's arms hung unnaturally long, fingers extending past where its knees should be. It stood so close to the Hendersons that its shadow should have been falling across them. But in the photograph, there was no shadow. The thing cast no darkness. Harold stood up so fast he knocked his coffee cup to the floor, where it shattered. He walked to the window and stared out at the mountains, trying to steady his breathing, trying to process what he'd just seen. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe it was a trick of light and shadow. A photographic error, double exposure from a camera malfunction. But Harold had been looking at wilderness photographs for over 2 decades. He knew what camera errors looked like. What he'd just seen was not an error. Something had been following the Henderson family up that trail. Something had gotten close enough to stand directly behind them while someone took their final photograph. And that something had led them to the cliff edge where their belongings were found. The investigation continued for 3 more weeks. Federal authorities got involved. The FBI opened a missing persons case. Search teams combed through hundreds of square miles, checking every trail, every cave, every possible location where 3 people might have sheltered or met with an accident. They found nothing. Robert, Patricia, and Jennifer Henderson had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. The case eventually went cold, filed away with other unsolved mysteries. The official conclusion: the family likely fell from the cliff and their bodies were carried away by the stream or covered by rockfall. Harold knew this was wrong, but he had no evidence for an alternative. He couldn't tell his superiors he believed the Hendersons had been taken by something that shouldn't exist, something that appeared in photographs with no face and cast no shadow. Harold requested a transfer to Olympic National Park the following spring. He couldn't keep working in the North Cascades after what he'd seen. For years afterward, he'd wake at night from dreams of that faceless figure standing in the forest, its impossibly long fingers reaching toward him through darkness. He kept copies of the photographs locked in a safe deposit box at his bank. He couldn't destroy them, but he couldn't look at them again either. The originals were sealed in an evidence locker somewhere in Seattle, forgotten by everyone except Harold. On his last day at the North Cascades Ranger Station, Harold drove up to Cascade Pass one final time. Early morning, summer sun just beginning to light the high peaks. He stood at the trailhead where the Henderson family had started their hike 7 months earlier, looking up at the trail winding through forest toward the alpine meadows. He thought about Robert's enthusiasm that October morning, about the birthday cake with 16 candles, about Jennifer's silver necklace lying on the rocks at the cliff edge, about the camera's final image and the thing that had followed them through the trees. As Harold turned to walk back to his truck, movement at the forest edge caught his eye. For just a moment, barely a heartbeat, he saw a tall, thin figure standing between 2 cedar trees, exactly where it had been in photograph 14. The figure was watching him. A face with no features. No eyes, no mouth. Nothing but smooth, pale skin stretched over bone. Then Harold blinked and the figure was gone. Only shadows and wind through branches remained. Harold got in his truck and drove away from the North Cascades for the last time. He never returned, and he never spoke publicly about what he'd seen in those photographs or what he witnessed at the trailhead that final morning. The Henderson family remains missing to this day. 3 names on a long list of people who walked into the wilderness and never came back. Search and rescue teams still operate in the North Cascades. They still patrol the trails, still respond when hikers don't return. But Harold knows, even if no one else does, that some disappearances can't be explained by bad weather or poor planning. Sometimes people vanish because something in those ancient forests decides to take them. Sometimes the mountains claim what they want, and no amount of searching will ever bring them home. The photographs remain locked in Harold's safe deposit box, rarely seen and never shown. On quiet nights when sleep won't come, Harold sometimes thinks about that final image. The Henderson family smiling together with the faceless figure standing behind them. He wonders if they ever saw what was following them. He wonders if they had any warning at all before the end came. Most of all, he wonders how many other families have posed for similar photographs in similar places, completely unaware of what stands behind them in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reach out with those impossibly long fingers and pull them into a darkness from which there is no return. Mabel Crawford had worked as the night caretaker at Paradise and on Mount Rainier for 15 years before she first met what the local Native American tribes called the Keeper. She was 63 years old, a widow whose grown children had moved to bigger cities years ago. Mabel had taken a caretaker job because she actually liked it. She enjoyed the quiet of winter nights when a massive lodge stood empty and silent, with nothing but the wind across the snowfields outside. She'd never been afraid of being alone. That was about to change. Paradise Inn was an incredible building, constructed in 1916 from huge cedar logs and local stone. It was designed for wealthy tourists who came to experience Mount Rainier's beauty during summer months. The inn sat at 5,400 feet elevation, surrounded by alpine meadows that burst with wildflowers in July and August, but lay buried under 30 feet of snow during the long winters. The inn closed to guests every October and didn't reopen until late May, a 7-month period when the building just needed someone to keep an eye on things. That's where Mabel came in. She lived in a small apartment in the inn's service wing, making rounds through the empty hallways 3 times each night. She checked for burst pipes, monitored the heating system, and made sure the building survived the brutal mountain winters without damage that would cost a fortune to fix come spring. Mabel had gotten used to the sounds old buildings make, especially in winter when temperatures dropped way below zero and ice formed thick on the windows. She knew which floorboards creaked, which doors swung open if not latched properly, which sections stayed colder than others because of heating quirks. She could navigate the entire inn in darkness if she had to, though she always carried a heavy flashlight during her rounds. The work wasn't hard, just monotonous. Mabel found comfort in the predictable routine. It was the 3rd week of February 1994 when everything changed. A massive winter storm rolled in from the Pacific Ocean, bringing winds that howled across the mountain like screaming voices. Snow fell so thick, Mabel couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the windows. Temperature dropped to 12 below zero. The entire building groaned under winds that seemed determined to tear it from its foundation. Mabel had weathered many storms during her years at Paradise Inn, but this one felt different. There was something about the wind that sounded too much like screaming. The darkness beyond the windows seemed to press against the glass like a living thing trying to force its way inside. Mabel began her midnight rounds as usual, starting from her apartment and working through the service areas before moving into the main lodge. The grand lobby was enormous, 3 stories tall with massive log beams supporting the ceiling and a stone fireplace you could walk inside. During summer, this space filled with guests, laughter, conversation, and firelight. Now it stood empty and cold, her flashlight beam seeming small and weak as it swept across the shadows. Mabel checked the main doors, confirmed they were locked, then headed toward the staircase leading to the guest room corridors on the upper floors. That's when she heard footsteps. They came from directly above her head, a slow, steady pace moving across the ceiling of the lobby. Mabel stopped and looked up, listening carefully. The footsteps continued, moving from the east side of the building toward the west, following the path of the second-floor corridor. Mabel's heartbeat quickened. There shouldn't be anyone else in the building. The road to paradise was closed, had been closed for months, buried under snow that wouldn't be cleared until April. The only way to reach the inn in winter was by snowshoe or cross-country skis, a journey of several miles through dangerous terrain. No one would make that trip in the middle of a winter storm. No one could. Mabel climbed the stairs to the second floor, flashlight steady despite her shaking hands. She emerged into the corridor and swept her beam along the hallway. Empty. All the guest room doors were closed, just as they should be. The footsteps had stopped. Mabel stood perfectly still, listening. Nothing but wind battering the building and her own rapid heartbeat. She walked slowly down the corridor, checking each door to make sure it was locked. Everything was secure, nothing out of place. Yet Mabel couldn't shake the certainty that she'd heard someone walking above her head. Footsteps with real weight and solidity that couldn't be explained by settling wood or expanding pipes. She completed her rounds and returned to her apartment, telling herself the storm was playing tricks on her. That isolation and darkness could make anyone imagine things that weren't there. She made tea and sat at her small kitchen table, waiting for her nerves to settle. The wind kept hammering the building. Somewhere outside, something crashed hard enough that Mabel jumped, spilling hot tea across her hand. She cleaned up and decided to go to bed early, pulling thick blankets over herself and trying to ignore the storm sounds. Sleep didn't come easily. Mabel lay awake, listening to the building around her. That's when she heard the footsteps again. They were in the corridor directly outside her apartment door, pacing back and forth with that same slow, steady rhythm. Mabel sat up in bed, breath coming in short gasps. She could see the thin line of space beneath her door. As she watched, a shadow moved across that space, blocking the faint light from the emergency exit sign down the hallway. Someone was standing just outside her door. Someone was pacing back and forth, feet from where she lay. Mabel forced herself to get up, to cross the room, to put her hand on the doorknob. She took a deep breath and pulled the door open quickly, flashlight raised. The corridor was empty, completely empty. But there on the floor, directly in front of her door, were footprints. They were wet, like someone had walked through deep snow and come inside without removing their boots. The footprints were impossibly large, each one nearly 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions spread wider than human toes should be. The prints led down the corridor toward the main building, leaving a wet trail across the worn carpet. Mabel followed them with her flashlight beam. They continued to the end of the service corridor, turned right into the main hallway, and headed toward the grand lobby. As Mabel followed, she noticed the footprints weren't tracking snow or mud. The wetness was clear like water, but it carried an overwhelming smell. Pine and decay, old-growth forest and things that had died and rotted under 1,000-year-old trees. The scent was so strong, Mabel had to cover her nose and mouth with her sleeve, fighting the urge to gag. The footprints ended at the wall opposite the grand staircase. They simply stopped like whoever or whatever had been walking and stepped straight through the solid log wall and disappeared. Mabel stood staring at the wall, her flashlight on the ancient wood. She felt something she hadn't experienced in many years, genuine fear. The kind that makes rational thought difficult and turns your stomach to ice. She backed away from the wall, turned, and hurried back to her apartment. She locked the door and pushed her dresser in front of it. Then she sat on her bed, fully dressed, flashlight in her lap, waiting for dawn. The storm finally broke on the third day. Mabel used the satellite phone in the office to call Park Service headquarters in Longmire. She reported what she'd experienced, trying to keep her voice steady, trying not to sound like a frightened old woman whose imagination had run wild during a storm. The ranger who answered was polite, but clearly skeptical. He assured her someone would come check on her as soon as roads could be cleared, which might take several days. Mabel thanked him and hung up, knowing no one would believe what she'd witnessed. That night, the footsteps returned. Mabel heard them moving through the upper floors, pacing the corridors, climbing stairs to the third floor where the expensive suites were located. She heard doors opening and closing, furniture scraping across wooden floors. She forced herself to investigate, driven by stubborn refusal to be terrorized in a building where she'd worked safely for 15 years. She climbed to the third floor and found chaos waiting. Every door along the corridor stood wide open. Furniture had been pulled from her rooms into the hallway. Chairs, tables, bed frames, all arranged in a pattern Mabel couldn't understand. The furniture formed a rough circle, all pieces facing inward toward the center of the corridor. In that central space, written on the floor in what looked like water or melted snow, was a symbol Mabel didn't recognize. It looked ancient, like something carved into stone by people who'd lived in these mountains long before Europeans arrived with their maps and names and buildings. Mabel stood at the top of the staircase, staring at the impossible scene. That's when she felt it. There was a presence in the corridor with her. Something massive and old and completely inhuman. She couldn't see it, but she could feel its attention focused on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The temperature in the corridor dropped so fast her breath became clouds of vapor. The lights flickered. Then, written across the walls in letters that dripped and ran like water, words appeared, "Leave this place." Mabel didn't sleep that night. She sat in her apartment with every light on, waiting for morning, wondering how she could possibly explain what was happening to anyone who hadn't seen it themselves. When dawn came, she packed a bag with essential belongings, ready to abandon her post, to walk away from the job and the isolation and the thing that had made its displeasure crystal clear. But before leaving, Mabel decided she needed to understand what she was dealing with. She needed to know why this was happening. She drove down the mountain as soon as the road was passable, heading to park headquarters where she requested access to the historical archives. The clerk seemed surprised to see her, but granted the request, leading her to a storage room filled with boxes of old documents, photographs, and records dating back to the park's early days. Mabel spent hours searching through yellowed papers and fading photographs until she found what she was looking for. Paradise had been built on land that local Native American tribes considered sacred. The meadows around the building weren't just beautiful alpine landscapes. They were ceremonial grounds, places where important rituals had been conducted for generations before white settlers arrived. The tribes had protested the inn's construction. They'd warned that building on sacred ground would anger the spirits protecting the mountain. Their warnings were ignored. The inn was built anyway, and the tribes were pushed further from their ancestral lands. But according to the documents, several construction workers had reported strange things during the building process. Tools disappeared. Materials went missing. Men claimed to see a tall figure watching from the tree line, a figure that left tracks in the snow too large to be human. Mabel found references to the Keeper, a spirit the tribes believed guarded Mount Rainier from those who would disrespect the mountain or desecrate sacred places. The Keeper was described as ancient beyond measure, neither fully physical nor entirely spirit, something existing in the spaces between. The Keeper didn't harm those who treated the mountain with respect, but it drove away those who didn't belong, those who took without giving, those who built without asking permission. Mabel returned to paradise and with offerings. She brought cedar branches and tobacco, items native people had traditionally used in their ceremonies. She arranged the offerings in the grand lobby and spoke aloud to the emptiness, apologizing for the intrusion, acknowledging that she and everyone who worked at the inn were guests on land that didn't belong to them. She promised to treat the building and the mountain with greater respect. To remember, she was living in a place that had been sacred long before it became a tourist destination. The footsteps stopped after that night. The furniture was never moved again. The doors remained closed and locked as they should be. Mabel completed her contract that winter and returned for many winters after. She never again heard footsteps in the corridors above her head. Never again saw those impossibly large tracks in the wet snow. But on certain nights when the wind blew cold across the mountain, Mabel would sometimes catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows of the forest edge. A tall figure standing among the trees, watching the inn with attention that felt both protective and warning. The keeper was still there, still guarding the sacred ground, still making its presence known to those who had the wisdom to pay attention. Doris Elkhart moved to the isolated logging town of Cedar Creek in spring 1991, drawn by cheap housing and the kind of quiet mountain life that had become impossible to find in Washington's rapidly growing cities. She was 57 years old, recently retired from teaching elementary school, and eager to spend her remaining years somewhere where life moved slower and neighbors still knew each other's names. Cedar Creek seemed perfect. The town had fewer than 200 permanent residents, most connected somehow to the logging industry that had kept the community alive for nearly a century. The houses were modest but well kept. Main Street had a general store, a small diner, and nothing else. The surrounding forest pressed close on all sides, creating a sense of peaceful isolation that Doris found deeply appealing. The people of Cedar Creek were welcoming when Doris first arrived. Neighbors helped her move furniture into the small two-bedroom house she'd bought at the end of Maple Street. The woman running the general store learned her preferences and stocked the brands of tea and coffee Doris liked. The men who gathered at the diner each morning for breakfast nodded politely when she came in for a meal. Yet despite this surface friendliness, Doris sensed something guarded in how the townspeople interacted with her. Conversations would stop abruptly when she entered a room. People exchanged meaningful glances she couldn't interpret. There was a sense of secrets being kept, information being withheld, a community that had closed ranks around something they didn't want outsiders to know. Doris figured this was normal small-town suspicion toward newcomers. She assumed that with time and patience, she'd be accepted more fully into the community. She volunteered at the small library, helped organize a park cleanup day, and made genuine efforts to build relationships with her neighbors. The townspeople remained polite but distant, friendly on the surface, but careful never to let her get too close. Doris found it frustrating, but not entirely unexpected. She told herself earning real acceptance in a place like Cedar Creek would take years, not months. Then autumn arrived, and with it came mention of the Harvest Festival. Doris first heard about it in late September at the general store. The owner, Margaret Simmons, who'd lived in Cedar Creek her entire life, was discussing arrangements with several other longtime residents. They talked about food preparation, coordinating schedules, making sure everything would be ready when the time came. When Doris asked about the festival and whether she could attend or help with preparations, the conversation stopped immediately. Margaret looked uncomfortable, exchanging glances with the other customers before explaining in carefully chosen words that the Harvest Festival was a private community event limited to families who'd lived in Cedar Creek for multiple generations. Newcomers, she said with an apologetic smile, weren't invited to participate until they'd lived in town for 7 full seasons. It was tradition, Margaret explained. Nothing personal. Doris was surprised but tried not to take offense. She understood rural communities often maintained traditions that seemed strange to outsiders. 7 seasons seemed like an arbitrary and excessive waiting period, but she supposed every town had its peculiarities. She thanked Margaret for explaining and left the store, dismissing it as just another example of small-town insularity. But as October progressed, Doris noticed the atmosphere in Cedar Creek began to change. The townspeople became increasingly distracted and excited, speaking in hushed tones about the upcoming festival. Children were kept close to home after school. Logging crews started working shorter hours, returning from the forest earlier each day. There was a sense of anticipation building, a feeling that something important was approaching that had nothing to do with Halloween or any holiday Doris recognized. The Harvest Festival was scheduled for the night of the new moon in late October, a date that seemed deliberately chosen to coincide with the darkest night of the month. On the day of the festival, the entire town shut down. The general store closed early. The diner served its last meal at noon and locked its doors. Doris watched from her front porch as her neighbors prepared to leave their homes, dressed in simple dark clothing and carrying bundles wrapped in cloth. They walked in small family groups toward the edge of town where a trail led deep into the surrounding forest. No one spoke. No one made eye contact with Doris as they passed. By nightfall, Cedar Creek was completely empty, except for Doris. Curiosity got the better of her. Doris had never been comfortable with being excluded, and the secrecy surrounding the Harvest Festival had grown from mildly annoying to genuinely disturbing. She told herself she just wanted to understand the community she'd chosen to join, that observing the festival from a distance would help her appreciate traditions that were clearly so important to these people. She put on dark clothing, grabbed a flashlight she kept switched off, and headed down the trail into the forest. The night was moonless and profoundly dark. Tall trees blocked what little starlight penetrated the cloud cover. Doris had to move carefully to avoid tripping over roots and rocks she could barely see. She'd been walking maybe 20 minutes when she began to see a glow through the trees ahead. Firelight, flickering and dancing, lighting up the trunks of ancient cedars and throwing shadows that moved like living things across the forest floor. Doris could hear voices now, many voices chanting in unison. The words weren't in any language she recognized. They had a rhythmic quality, rising and falling in patterns that seemed designed to match the crackle and roar of what must be a very large fire. Doris left the trail and moved through the underbrush as quietly as possible, approaching the light from an angle that would let her observe without being seen. What Doris saw when she reached the edge of a large clearing took her breath away and filled her with immediate, overwhelming wrongness. The entire population of Cedar Creek had gathered in a natural amphitheater formed by massive cedar trees. Some had to be hundreds of years old. In the center burned a bonfire of extraordinary size, flames reaching 30 feet into the air, throwing off waves of heat Doris could feel even from her hidden position at the tree line. The townspeople had arranged themselves in circles around the fire, all facing inward, all chanting in that strange language that made Doris's chest vibrate and her teeth ache. At the very center, closest to the fire, stood what appeared to be 5 large human figures. They were constructed from bundles of branches and brush, bound together with rope and positioned upright on wooden frames. Each figure was roughly 8 feet tall, shaped to suggest a human form with outstretched arms and a rounded head. They were clearly effigies, representations of human shapes meant to be burned as part of some ritual Doris didn't understand. She'd read about similar practices in various cultures. Symbolic burnings meant to represent the end of harvest season or to ward off winter's darkness. The sight was unsettling, but not immediately alarming. Then the chanting changed. The rhythm accelerated, becoming more urgent, more frenzied. The townspeople began to move, swaying in place, some dancing with jerking movements that looked more like seizures than coordinated motion. Margaret Simmons, the kindly store owner who'd always been so pleasant to Doris, stepped forward from the crowd. She was carrying something in her arms, wrapped in white cloth. Other people came forward too, each carrying similar bundles. They approached the 5 effigies and began unwrapping the cloth, revealing what lay beneath. Doris felt her stomach lurch. She had to clap a hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. The bundles contained bones. Human bones, skulls and rib cages, and long bones from arms and legs. Old and yellowed with age, but unmistakably human. The townspeople were carefully positioning these bones within the effigies, weaving them into the framework of branches and brush, transforming what Doris had thought were simple symbolic figures into something far more disturbing. These weren't representations of humans. These were structures built around actual human remains. The effigies weren't purely symbolic. They were monuments to death, reliquaries constructed from the bodies of people who had died in ways Doris couldn't begin to imagine. Margaret Simmons began to speak, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. She wasn't speaking in a strange language anymore, but in perfectly ordinary English, with the same friendly tone she used helping customers at the store. She spoke about prosperity and protection, about the bargain struck generations ago when the logging industry first came to this valley. She spoke about forest spirits who'd ruled these woods since time immemorial. Ancient powers that demanded tribute in exchange for allowing humans to take the trees that were their children. She spoke about the 5 founders of Cedar Creek, the original loggers who discovered the ritual and performed it first, who'd given themselves willingly to the forest so their descendants could prosper and the logging could continue without disaster or ruin. The chanting resumed, louder now, building towards some crescendo Doris desperately didn't want to witness. The townspeople began feeding the effigies into the bonfire one at a time, lifting the heavy structures and carrying them forward until they could tip them into the flames. The first effigy hit the fire with an explosion of sparks and a sound like screaming. Though whether the sound came from burning wood or something else, Doris couldn't be certain. The smell that rose from the fire was nauseating. A combination of burning pine and something far more organic, far more disturbing. It was the smell of burning bone, of flesh that had long since dried and mummified, but still contained enough material to produce that distinctive stench of cremation. Doris knew she had to leave, had to get away before she was discovered. If the townspeople found her witnessing their secret ritual, their carefully guarded tradition, she didn't think they'd simply escort her home with a polite warning to mind her own business. She began backing away from the clearing, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. She made it maybe 50 feet when her foot came down on a dry branch. It snapped with a crack like a gunshot. The chanting stopped instantly. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. Doris froze, not daring to breathe, knowing hundreds of eyes were now searching the darkness at the clearing's edge. A voice called out, Margaret Simmons again, but her tone was no longer friendly. She called for people to search the perimeter to find whoever was hiding in the trees. Doris heard movement, people crashing through the underbrush on either side of her position. She abandoned any attempt at stealth and ran, crashing through the forest in blind panic. Her only thought, reach the trail and get back to town before they caught her. She could hear them behind her, calling to each other, coordinating their search. They knew these woods far better than she did. They could navigate in darkness that left her stumbling and disoriented. Doris wasn't sure how she found the trail. Maybe instinct, maybe simple luck let her blunder onto the path just when her pursuers were closing in. She ran harder than she'd run in decades, lungs burning, heart hammering. She could still hear them behind her, but couldn't tell how close they were or how many. When she finally burst from the tree line into the empty streets of Cedar Creek, she didn't stop running. She ran straight to her house, slammed the door, and locked every window and door. She pulled curtains closed and sat in darkness, listening, waiting to hear footsteps on her porch or fists pounding on her door. The footsteps never came. No one knocked. As dawn broke over Cedar Creek, Doris watched through a crack in her curtains as her neighbors returned from the forest, walking in small groups, speaking quietly to each other, looking like ordinary people returning from an ordinary community event. They dispersed to their homes and disappeared inside. By mid-morning, the town seemed completely normal. The general store opened. The diner began serving breakfast. It was as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Doris packed her belongings that day. She loaded everything she could fit into her car and drove away from Cedar Creek without looking back, abandoning the house she'd purchased and the quiet life she'd hoped to build. She never reported what she'd seen. Who would believe her? What evidence did she have beyond her own testimony? She had no photographs, no proof, nothing but memories of fire and bones and ordinary people engaged in something that shouldn't exist in the modern world. Years later, Doris would sometimes see news stories about Cedar Creek, about logging operations that continued to thrive there while other timber towns struggled and failed. She'd see photographs of the town and recognize faces. People who'd been in that clearing, people who'd fed human remains into a bonfire while chanting to forest spirits. They looked so normal in the photographs, so ordinary and harmless. But Doris knew better. She knew what they were capable of, what they'd done to ensure their prosperity. She knew about the bargain their ancestors had struck and the terrible price that had been paid to keep that bargain alive. Eugene Peton served as the lighthouse keeper at Cape Perpetua for 37 years before his mysterious disappearance in March 1989. He was a man of habit and routine, qualities that served him well in a job that demanded absolute reliability and attention to detail. The lighthouse at Cape Perpetua stood on a rocky point jutting into the Pacific Ocean, a towering white structure that had guided ships safely past treacherous coastal rocks since 1874. Eugene had inherited the position from his father, who'd inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Petons had kept the light burning, maintained the station, and watched over the dangerous waters where the Oregon coast met the full fury of the Pacific. Eugene lived alone in the keeper's cottage next to the lighthouse tower. His wife had passed away in 1982, and his children had long since moved to inland cities where jobs were more plentiful. He didn't mind the solitude. In fact, he preferred it. The isolation of the lighthouse station suited him perfectly. He kept meticulous records of weather conditions, ship traffic, and maintenance activities. His logbooks were models of precision and clarity, documenting every detail of his daily routine with an almost obsessive thoroughness that his Coast Guard superiors had come to depend on. In early March 1989, Eugene's logbook entries began to change. The first unusual notation appeared on March 3rd. Eugene wrote that he'd observed a sailing vessel approaching the lighthouse at approximately 2 a.m. The ship was a 3-masted schooner, running with full sails despite calm conditions and no wind. Eugene had tried to contact the vessel by radio, but received no response. He noted that the ship's running lights appeared unusually dim and that its course seemed erratic, like the captain was uncertain of the proper heading. The ship eventually turned away from the coast and disappeared into the darkness. Eugene concluded the entry by noting that no vessel matching that description was listed on any shipping schedules he maintained, and that weather conditions at the time made sailing under full canvas both unusual and unnecessary. The second entry came on March 5th. Eugene reported seeing the same schooner again, this time approaching even closer to shore. He described the vessel in greater detail. Its sails appear to be made of badly weathered and stained canvas. The ship's hull showed signs of extensive damage, with visible gaps in the planking near the waterline. Eugene wrote that he'd again attempted radio contact with no success. But this time he reported hearing voices calling out from the ship. The voices were speaking, but Eugene couldn't identify the language. He wrote that it sounded older than words, a phrase his supervisor would later find particularly unsettling. The ship had once again turned away before reaching the rocks. sailing back out to sea despite the fact that Eugene could observe no wind strong enough to fill its sails. Over the next week, Eugene's entries became increasingly detailed and increasingly disturbing. The schooner appeared every night, always between midnight and dawn, always approaching the lighthouse before turning away at the last moment. Eugene began to recognize individual crew members on the deck. He described them as wearing clothing that seemed decades out of date, heavy wool coats, and caps that reminded him of photographs from the late 1800s. The crew members would call out to him, their voices carrying clearly across the water despite the distance and the sound of waves crashing against rocks. Eugene still couldn't understand the words they spoke, but he became convinced they were trying to communicate something important. On March 10th, Eugene's entry took a dramatic turn. He wrote that he'd finally been able to make out some of what the crew was saying. They were calling his name over and over again. Voices from a ship were calling Eugene Peton across the dark water. The captain, a tall figure standing at the wheel on the quarterdeck, had raised his hand and beckoned to Eugene, gesturing for him to come aboard. Eugene wrote that he'd felt an almost overwhelming compulsion to respond to that gesture, to leave the lighthouse and find some way to reach the ship that called to him every night. He resisted the compulsion, he wrote, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to do so. The March 12th entry was even more alarming. Eugene reported that the crew had been asking him to join them for 6 consecutive nights. He wrote that the captain had called out to him in perfect English, explaining that they'd been sailing these waters since before the lighthouse was built. Eugene described seeing the faces of the crew members clearly for the first time, illuminated by lanterns that cast a pale greenish light across the deck. And he recognized those faces. They belonged to men who had died during the construction of the lighthouse in 1874. Workers who'd fallen from scaffolding or been swept into the sea by rogue waves. Eugene knew their names from the memorial plaque installed at the base of the lighthouse tower. Thomas Whitmore, Samuel Chun, Patrick O'Brien, James Newcastle, 15 men in total who'd perished before the lighthouse was completed. Eugene's second-to-last entry was brief and chilling. He wrote that he now understood why the dead men kept returning to Cape Perpetua. The lighthouse had been built on ground that should have remained empty. The rocky promontory was a sacred site, a place where indigenous peoples had conducted ceremonies for the dead for countless generations before white settlers arrived and claimed the land for their own purposes. The spirits of the men who died building the lighthouse couldn't rest because the structure itself was an intrusion, a violation of sacred ground. They were trapped between life and death, sailing eternally along a coastline they could never leave, calling out to the living in hopes of finding someone who could understand their plight. The final entry in Eugene Peton's logbook was dated March 14, 1989. The handwriting was shaky, less precise than Eugene's usual careful script. He wrote that the ship had approached closer than ever before, so close he could have thrown a stone and hit its hull. The captain had called to him again, inviting him to join the crew. Eugene wrote that he could see now that the captain was his own grandfather, Jeremiah Peton, who'd supposedly retired from the lighthouse service in 1923 and moved to Portland, where he died of pneumonia in 1925. But here was Jeremiah, standing on the deck of the ghostly schooner, looking exactly as he appeared in the old photographs Eugene kept in his cottage. Jeremiah explained that he'd never actually left Cape Perpetua. That lighthouse keepers never truly left. That they all eventually joined the crew of the ship that sailed these waters forever. Eugene's final words were, "They have been asking me to join their crew for 6 days now. The captain says they have been sailing these waters since before the lighthouse was built. I can see their faces clearly now. They're the men who died building this place in 1874. Tonight, I understand why they keep returning. Tonight, I will give them the answer they have been waiting for." Coast Guard investigators arrived at Cape Perpetua on March 16th after Eugene failed to respond to scheduled radio check-ins. They found a lighthouse in perfect operational order. The light was functioning properly. The lens was clean. All equipment was maintained to the exacting standards Eugene had always upheld. His cottage was neat and organized with no signs of struggle or distress. His coat still hung on its peg by the door. His breakfast dishes from March 14th were washed and put away. The logbook sat open on his desk to the final entry. Eugene Peton himself was nowhere to be found. A thorough search of the station and surrounding area revealed no trace of the missing keeper. There were no footprints leading away from the lighthouse. No indication Eugene had packed belongings or prepared to leave. The only boat at the station remained tied to the small dock, undamaged and unused. Eugene had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but his carefully maintained records and that final cryptic entry. The Coast Guard officially classified Eugene's disappearance as unexplained and eventually presumed him dead after the required time elapsed. The lighthouse was automated shortly after, no longer requiring a human keeper to maintain its operation. But local fishermen who work the waters off Cape Perpetua report that on foggy nights, particularly during the dark of the moon, they sometimes see a figure standing in the lighthouse tower. The figure waves at passing ships, warning them away from the dangerous rocks below, keeping watch over the coastline just as Eugene Peton did for 37 years. And occasionally, very occasionally, fishermen report seeing a three-masted schooner sailing through the fog near Cape Perpetua. The ship runs with full sails despite the absence of wind. Its crew visible on deck, calling out in voices that sound like wind and waves in grief. Those who claim to have seen the ship say that among the crew is a figure who looks remarkably like the photographs of Eugene Peton that were published in newspapers after his disappearance. He stands at the rail, watching the lighthouse he once tended. Forever sailing the waters, he spent his life making safe for others, unable to leave the place that claimed him in the end. Gladys Morrison volunteered for a university psychological study in winter 1993 that required spending 6 weeks alone in a remote cabin in the Olympic National Forest. She was 61 years old, a retired librarian with no close family ties and genuine curiosity about the limits of human endurance in isolation. The study was being conducted by researchers from the University of Washington Psychology Department, investigating the effects of complete solitude on cognitive function, emotional stability, and sensory perception. Gladys had read about similar experiments and found the concept fascinating. The compensation was generous, and more importantly, she'd be contributing to scientific understanding of how the human mind coped with extended periods alone. The researchers explained the protocol in detail during preliminary meetings. Gladys would be taken to a cabin located approximately 12 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking trail. The cabin was equipped with basic necessities: a wood stove for heating, a propane stove for cooking, sufficient food supplies for the entire 6-week period, water from a nearby spring, and a chemical toilet. There would be no electricity, no telephone, no contact with the outside world except for weekly radio check-ins with the research team. During these check-ins, which would occur every Sunday at precisely 2 p.m., Gladys would answer a series of standardized questions about her mental state, sleep patterns, and any unusual experiences or observations. The researchers would monitor her responses for signs of psychological distress, and if necessary, they could terminate the experiment early and extract her from the location. Gladys signed the consent forms and underwent a complete physical and psychological evaluation to ensure she was suitable for the study. The researchers seemed satisfied with her baseline assessments. She was intelligent, emotionally stable, and had realistic expectations about the challenges of extended isolation. In early January, on a gray morning when frost covered every surface and her breath formed clouds in the cold air, Gladys was driven to the trailhead and escorted to the cabin by 2 research assistants who carried her supplies and explained the operation of the radio equipment one final time. Then they left, and Gladys found herself alone in a way she'd never experienced before. The first week passed more easily than Gladys had anticipated. She established a routine that gave structure to her days. She woke with the dawn, prepared a simple breakfast, spent the morning reading from the selection of books the researchers had provided, took an afternoon walk to gather firewood and observe the forest around her, prepared dinner, and spent the evening writing in the journal she'd been asked to maintain. The silence was profound but not oppressive. Gladys found she enjoyed the absence of human noise. The constant background hum of civilization she'd lived with her entire life without really noticing until it was gone. The second week brought the first signs of difficulty. Gladys began to notice the silence wasn't truly complete. The forest was full of sounds. Wind moving through trees, branches creaking, small animals rustling in underbrush, distant bird calls. Her mind began to interpret these natural sounds in strange ways. A falling pine cone became footsteps on the cabin roof. The wind, rattling a loose shutter, became someone trying to open the door. Gladys understood this was a normal psychological response to isolation. Exactly the kind of phenomenon the researchers were interested in studying. She made detailed notes in her journal and reported these experiences during her Sunday radio check-in. The researchers assured her that auditory misinterpretation was common and expected. They told her to continue documenting these experiences, but not to be alarmed. By the third week, the sounds had evolved into something more distinct. Gladys was hearing voices. They came at night after she'd extinguished the lantern and lay in her narrow bed, listening to the darkness. The voices were faint at first, barely distinguishable from the wind, but they grew clearer with each passing night. They seemed to be coming from just outside the cabin, speaking in conversational tones too low for Gladys to make out specific words. She knew this was likely an auditory hallucination, a product of her isolated brain trying to create the human interaction it was being denied. She found the voices more fascinating than frightening and began to listen carefully, trying to determine if there were patterns in the sound her mind was generating. During her third Sunday check-in, Gladys reported the voices to the research team. She described them clinically, using precise language of someone who understood she was experiencing a psychological phenomenon rather than an actual external stimulus. The lead researcher, Dr. Patricia Chun, seemed pleased with Gladys's observations. She explained that auditory hallucinations were a well-documented response to sensory deprivation and social isolation. Dr. Chun assured Gladys that as long as she maintained awareness, the voices weren't real. There was no cause for concern. The experiment would continue as planned. But the voices didn't remain ambiguous for long. By the fourth week, Gladys could understand what they were saying. There were 3 distinct voices, a woman, a man, and a child. They were talking to each other, carrying on mundane conversations about daily activities and simple observations about the weather and forest. The woman's voice reminded Gladys of her own mother, who'd passed away 15 years earlier. The man spoke with a gentle tone that suggested kindness and patience. The child, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8 years old based on the pitch and cadence of her speech, asked questions with innocent curiosity that Gladys remembered from her years working with children in the library. Gladys began to respond to the voices. At first, she simply acknowledged them, saying good evening when they appeared after dark, offering simple replies when they seemed to address her directly. The voices responded in turn, becoming more animated, more engaged. They introduced themselves. The woman was Margaret. The man was Thomas. The child was Susan. They told Gladys they'd lived in this part of the forest long ago, that they'd been a family here before something terrible happened. They didn't specify what that terrible thing had been, but Gladys sensed profound sadness in their voices when they spoke of it. By the beginning of the 5th week, The voices had become constant companions. They spoke to Gladys throughout the day, not just at night. Margaret would comment on the meals Gladys prepared, offering suggestions for how to improve the flavor with herbs that grew near the cabin. Thomas would discuss the weather, warning Gladys when storms were approaching. Susan would ask Gladys to read aloud from her books, and Gladys would comply, finding comfort in the act of reading to an audience, even if that audience existed only in her own mind. She knew on some level that she was losing her grip on reality. She knew healthy people didn't have extended conversations with hallucinations. But she also felt less lonely than she had at any point in the experiment. And loneliness, she reasoned, was far more dangerous than friendly voices. The scheduled check-in on the fifth Sunday revealed the extent of Gladys's deterioration. When Dr. Chen asked the standard questions about unusual experiences, Gladys spoke enthusiastically about her new friends. She described Margaret, Thomas, and Susan in detail, explaining how helpful they'd been, how much comfort their presence provided. Dr. Chen's voice over the radio became tense. She asked Gladys directly whether she understood these individuals weren't real. Gladys hesitated, then admitted she was no longer certain. The voices seemed real enough. They knew things Gladys didn't know, like where to find the best firewood or which berries near the cabin were safe to eat. How could hallucinations possess knowledge she herself didn't have? Dr. Chen made the decision to terminate the experiment immediately. She told Gladys that a team would arrive the following morning to escort her back to civilization. Gladys agreed calmly. But after the radio check-in ended, Margaret's voice spoke clearly in the cabin. She warned Gladys that the researchers would try to separate them. That leaving the cabin would mean losing the only friend Gladys had. Thomas agreed, his voice taking on an urgent quality. He reminded Gladys how lonely she'd been before they arrived, how empty her life would be without their companionship. Susan began to cry, pleading with Gladys not to abandon them. When the research team arrived at the cabin on Monday morning, they found Gladys sitting calmly at the small table, a pot of tea steeping in front of her. She'd arranged 3 empty chairs around the table, and she was speaking animatedly to the air as though engaged in conversation with invisible companions. Dr. Chen entered the cabin cautiously, assessing the situation. She called Gladys's name. Gladys turned and smiled, apparently pleased to see her. She gestured to the empty chairs and introduced the researchers to Margaret, Thomas, and little Susan, who were sitting right there. Would they like some tea as well? Dr. Chen attempted to convince Gladys to leave the cabin. She explained gently but firmly that the experiment was over, that Gladys needed to return with them for psychological evaluation and treatment. Gladys listened politely, then shook her head. She explained she couldn't possibly leave now. Her friends needed her. They'd been alone in this forest for so long, trapped here by the tragedy that had befallen them. Margaret had finally told her the full story just that morning. In the winter of 1932, a family had been caught in a terrible blizzard while hiking through this area. They'd taken shelter in a trapper's cabin that had once stood on this very spot. They'd frozen to death waiting for rescue that never came. Their bodies hadn't been found until spring. Now their spirits remained here, lonely and frightened, desperate for human contact and companionship. Gladys explained all this in a calm, rational tone that made her delusion all the more disturbing. She told Dr. Chen she decided to stay at the cabin permanently. The experiment was over for the researchers, but it was just beginning for her. She finally had a purpose, a reason to be needed. She would keep Margaret, Thomas, and Susan company. She'd make sure they were never lonely again. The research team could report whatever they wanted, but Gladys wasn't leaving. Dr. Chen spent 3 hours trying to reason with Gladys, trying different approaches, different arguments. Nothing worked. Gladys remained adamant she was staying. Eventually, Dr. Chun made the difficult decision to have Gladys removed from the cabin against her will. It took 2 research assistants to physically guide Gladys out of the cabin while she protested and called out to her invisible friends, promising them she would return, that she wouldn't abandon them forever. As they led her down the trail towards civilization and the psychiatric evaluation that awaited her, Gladys kept looking back over her shoulder, tears streaming down her face, reaching towards something only she could see. Walter Thornton had worked the night shift at Aberdeen's largest sawmill for 14 years when the winter of 1988 brought a series of brutal murders that would terrorize the small logging community and haunt him for the rest of his life. He was 59 years old, a shift supervisor responsible for overseeing the skeleton crew that kept the mill running through the dark hours between midnight and 8 a.m. Aberdeen was a town built on timber. Its entire economy depended on the massive trees cut from the surrounding forests and processed into lumber at facilities like the one where Walter worked. The mill ran 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. The screaming of saw blades and thunder of heavy machinery never stopped, except on Sundays when even the most dedicated workers rested. The first victim was discovered on the morning of January 12th. Raymond Kowalski, a night shift worker who operated the debarking machine, had failed to show up for his shift that evening. His supervisor assumed he was sick and assigned another worker to cover his station. When Raymond's wife called the mill the following morning to report her husband had never come home from work, a search was initiated. Raymond's truck was found in the employee parking lot, exactly where he'd left it when he arrived for his shift the previous night. Raymond himself was discovered in the lumber yard, his body arranged among stacks of freshly cut 2x4s. Walter was called to the scene along with the Aberdeen police. What he saw that morning would replay in his nightmares for years afterward. Raymond Kowalski had been killed with deliberate brutality. His body had been mutilated by what the investigating officers immediately recognized as sawmill equipment. Circular saw marks were visible on his torso and limbs. A lumber hook had been driven through his chest. The killer had used tools that every mill worker handled daily, had turned the instruments of their livelihood into weapons of shocking violence. The police cordoned off the area and began interviewing employees, but no one had seen anything unusual during the night shift. Raymond had simply vanished somewhere between the main building and the parking lot, and no one had noticed he was missing until it was too late. The second murder occurred exactly 1 week later. Martin Deschamps, who ran the planing machine during night operations, was found in similar condition. His body had been positioned inside one of the massive storage sheds where finished lumber awaited shipment. The same brutal methodology had been employed. Saw blades, industrial chisels, and the heavy steel hooks used for moving logs had all been used on Martin's body with a precision that suggested intimate familiarity with how those tools functioned. The Aberdeen police brought in detectives from the State Criminal Investigation Division. They established that both victims had worked the same shift, had been employed at the mill for similar lengths of time, and had both been killed using equipment from the facility where they worked. Walter attended both funerals. He'd known Raymond and Martin for years, had supervised their work, had shared coffee with them during breaks. The senselessness of their deaths disturbed him almost as much as the brutality. Aberdeen was a small town where violent crime was rare. People knew each other. Doors were left unlocked. Children played outside without supervision. The idea that a killer was stalking mill workers, targeting them in the place where they earned their living, created an atmosphere of fear that settled over the town like fog from the nearby harbor. The third victim was discovered on February 2nd. Thomas Carlisle, a forklift operator on the night shift, was found in the boiler room. The fourth victim, Edward Chun, who worked in the shipping department, was discovered on February 9th in one of the equipment maintenance bays. The fifth victim, James Whitmore, a general laborer, was found on February 16th near the log pond where raw timber was stored before processing. Each murder followed the same pattern. The victims worked night shift. They were killed with sawmill equipment. Their bodies were positioned in locations around the facility, always hidden, but always eventually discovered. The killers seemed to want the bodies found, seemed to be making some kind of statement that Walter and the investigators couldn't decipher. The mill owners considered shutting down night operations entirely, but the economic impact would have been devastating. Instead, they implemented new security measures. Guards were posted at all entrances. Workers were required to move in pairs. Police maintained a presence at the facility during night hours. Walter found himself watching his crew with suspicion, wondering if the killer might be someone he worked alongside every night. Someone who smiled and joked and seemed completely ordinary while harboring the capacity for such horrific violence. It was Walter who finally recognized the pattern. He was reviewing personnel files in the mill office, comparing the names of the victims, when he noticed something the police had apparently missed. All 5 murdered men had been employed at the mill in 1981. All 5 had been working the day shift on June 17th of that year, the day of the accident. Walter felt his blood run cold as he pulled the incident report from the archives and read through details he'd tried for 7 years to forget. The accident had occurred during routine logging operations at one of the harvest sites 20 miles east of Aberdeen. A massive Douglas fir had been improperly cut, the weight distribution misjudged by the felling crew. When the tree came down, it fell in an unexpected direction, crushing Samuel Morrison, a young logger who'd been standing in what should have been a safe zone. Samuel had died instantly. His body so badly mangled the casket at his funeral had been closed. The investigation had ruled the death accidental, the result of human error and the inherent dangers of logging work. No one had been held criminally responsible. The 6 men on the felling crew that day had been given additional safety training and returned to work after a brief suspension. Walter stared at the names on that felling crew list. Raymond Kowalski, Martin Deschamps, Thomas Carlyle, Edward Chun, James Whitmore, and one more name, David Patterson. Walter's hands were shaking as he picked up the phone and called the lead detective on the case. He explained what he discovered, the connection between all 5 victims, the logging accident from 7 years ago. The detective listened carefully and asked the obvious question: where was David Patterson now? Walter checked the shift schedule. David Patterson was currently on duty, working the night shift in the mill's main cutting room. The detective told Walter to stay where he was. Police were on their way, but Walter couldn't stay put. David Patterson was out there with the rest of the night crew, men who had no idea they might be working alongside a serial killer. Walter left the office and made his way through the facility toward the cutting room, the sounds of machinery echoing through the vast space. He found David Patterson standing alone near the largest circular saw, a massive blade that could cut through logs 3 feet in diameter. David was staring at the spinning blade with an expression Walter couldn't quite read. Walter approached slowly, calling out David's name to be heard over the noise of equipment. David turned, and Walter saw he was crying, tears running down his face while his jaw was set in an expression of terrible determination. In his hand, David held a lumber hook, the same type of implement that had been used to kill Raymond Kowalski. Walter asked David to put down the hook. David shook his head slowly. He asked Walter if he remembered Samuel Morrison. Walter said of course he remembered. Samuel had been 23 years old, newly married, with a baby daughter he'd never see grow up. David said Samuel had been his cousin, the closest friend he had in the world. David had been the one to find Samuel's body crushed beneath that massive tree. He'd been the one to tell Samuel's wife her husband was never coming home. David explained the accident hadn't been an accident at all. The 6 men on that felling crew had been cutting corners, ignoring safety protocols because they were being pressured to meet quotas and maximize productivity. They'd known the tree was dangerous. They'd known Samuel was standing too close. They'd made the cut anyway, and Samuel had paid the price for their negligence and greed. David had spent 7 years watching those men continue their lives, continue working, continue laughing and joking as though they hadn't killed his cousin through their carelessness. Walter tried to reason with David, tried to explain that revenge wouldn't bring Samuel back, that David would be throwing away his own life. But David was beyond reason. He'd already thrown away his life, he said. He'd thrown it away the moment he decided the men responsible for Samuel's death needed to face justice the courts had failed to provide. There was only one name left on his list. Only one more man who needed to pay for what happened on that June day 7 years ago. David raised a lumber hook and stepped toward Walter. Walter realized with horror that David had made a critical error. David hadn't been using an old personnel file to identify the men from the felling crew. David had been there that day. David knew exactly who'd been responsible. But David had made one mistake. Walter hadn't been on the felling crew. Walter had been working at the mill that day, nowhere near the logging site where Samuel Morrison died. Walter pointed this out, his voice steady despite his fear. He told David to check his facts, to look at the personnel records one more time. David hesitated, confusion replacing certainty in his expression. That moment of hesitation gave the police time to arrive, to flood into the cutting room with weapons drawn, to surround David Patterson and order him to drop the lumber hook and surrender. David complied. He set down the hook and allowed himself to be handcuffed without resistance. As the police led him away, he turned to look at Walter one final time. He apologized for the mistake, for nearly killing an innocent man. He said he'd been so certain, so focused on finishing what he'd started, that he hadn't verified the final name on his list. Walter watched David being taken into custody and felt nothing but profound sadness. Another life destroyed by that accident 7 years ago. Another victim of the logging industry's constant demand for productivity and profit. The sixth and final member of the felling crew, whose name Walter never learned, left Aberdeen the night David Patterson was arrested. He disappeared into wherever people go when they're running from the consequences of their actions. The Aberdeen sawmill implemented new safety protocols and held mandatory training sessions on workplace responsibility. But Walter knew no amount of training would prevent future accidents in an industry where profit would always be prioritized over safety. He worked one more year at the mill, then retired, unable to continue working in a place where he could still see Raymond Kowalski's body among the lumber stacks every time he closed his eyes. Beatrice Hammond had worked as a ferry operator between the San Juan Islands for over 20 years when she first encountered the vessel that would haunt her for the remainder of her career. She was 55 years old in the autumn of 1996, a veteran of the Washington State ferry system who navigated the treacherous waters of Puget Sound in every kind of weather imaginable. Beatrice knew these waters better than she knew the streets of her own neighborhood. She could judge tide and current by instinct alone, could pilot her vessel through fog so thick visibility dropped to mere feet, could dock at any of the island terminals with a precision that younger operators admired and tried unsuccessfully to copy. She'd seen nearly everything the sea could throw at her, or so she believed until that November night when the Phantom Ferry appeared for the first time. The evening had started routinely enough. Beatrice was making the final run of the day from Friday Harbor to Orcas Island, her ferry carrying only a handful of passengers and 3 vehicles. Winter was approaching, and tourist traffic had dwindled to almost nothing. The locals who depended on the ferry system for transportation between islands were accustomed to the reduced schedule and the long, dark evenings that came with the season. Beatrice enjoyed these quiet runs. She could focus on the simple pleasure of navigation, of guiding her vessel through water that reflected the lights of distant towns like scattered stars. The fog rolled in around 8 p.m., thick and unseasonably dense. Beatrice reduced her speed and switched on the forward searchlights, their beams cutting through the murk and illuminating swirling banks of mist that seemed to have substance and weight. Visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. Beatrice relied on her instruments and her knowledge of the route, following coordinates and depth soundings that told her exactly where she was even when she could see almost nothing of her surroundings. This wasn't the first time she navigated in heavy fog, and it wouldn't be the last. That's when she saw it. A vessel emerged from the fog bank ahead, moving on a course that would intersect with her own if neither ship altered heading. Beatrice immediately reduced speed further and reached for her radio to establish contact. She could see the other vessel was a ferry, but it was unlike any ferry currently operating in the Puget Sound system. The design was old-fashioned, with a profile that reminded Beatrice of photographs she'd seen from the 1940s. The ferry's running lights were visible but strangely dim, casting a pale yellow glow that seemed to be absorbed by the fog rather than penetrating it. No name was visible on the hull, and Beatrice could see passengers moving behind windows that were illuminated from within by what appeared to be incandescent bulbs rather than modern fluorescent lighting. Beatrice keyed her radio and called out on the standard maritime frequency, requesting identification and coordination for safe passage. The response came immediately, but the quality of the transmission was poor, filled with static and interference that made the words difficult to understand. A man's voice identified himself as Captain Robert McKinnon of the MV Kalakala, requesting permission to proceed to the Friday Harbor Terminal. Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of her enclosed bridge. She knew the name Kalakala. Every ferry operator in Puget Sound knew that name. The MV Kalakala had been an iconic vessel, a streamlined Art Deco ferry that had operated between Seattle and Bremerton for decades before being decommissioned in 1967 and eventually sold to owners in Alaska who'd moved it far from its original waters. More importantly, Beatrice knew that Captain Robert McKinnon had died in 1951 when the Kalakala supposedly sank during a Christmas Eve storm while attempting an unauthorized crossing to the San Juan Islands. The official investigation had concluded that McKinnon had been trying to make extra runs during the holiday season, transporting islanders who were desperate to reach their families despite dangerous weather conditions. The ferry had gone down with 43 passengers and crew aboard. There had been no survivors. The wreck had never been located, lost somewhere in the deep waters between the islands where currents and depth made recovery operations nearly impossible. Beatrice stared at the vessel in front of her, her rational mind insisting that what she was seeing couldn't possibly be real, while her eyes told her a different story. The phantom ferry continued to approach, and Beatrice could now see details that made the impossible nature of the situation even more apparent. The passengers visible through the windows were dressed in clothing from the 1950s. Women wore long coats and hats with veils. Men wore fedoras and heavy wool overcoats. Children pressed their faces against the glass, waving at Beatrice's ferry with the innocent enthusiasm of young travelers excited to be on a boat. None of them seemed to realize anything was wrong, that they were sailing on a vessel that shouldn't exist, heading toward a destination they would never reach. Captain McKinnon's voice came through the radio again, clearer now. He repeated his request for permission to dock at Friday Harbor. He explained he was running behind schedule due to the weather, that his passengers were anxious to reach the islands before Christmas Eve ended, that families were waiting. Beatrice found herself responding automatically, her training taking over while her conscious mind struggled to process what was happening. She granted clearance for the Kalakala to proceed, then watched as the Phantom ferry acknowledged her transmission and altered course slightly, heading toward Friday Harbor on a route that would take it directly past Beatrice's position. The two vessels passed within 100 yards of each other. Beatrice stood at her bridge windows, staring across the dark water at the impossible sight. She could see Captain McKinnon standing at the wheel of the Kalakala, a tall figure in a captain's uniform from another era. He raised his hand in a salute as the vessels passed, a gesture of professional courtesy between mariners. Beatrice raised her own hand in response, unable to do anything else. She watched as the phantom ferry continued toward Friday Harbor, its dim lights fading into the fog. Then, just before it disappeared entirely, the vessel simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, solid and real. The next moment it was gone, leaving behind only empty water and swirling mist. Beatrice completed her run to Orcas Island in a state of shock. She said nothing to her passengers or crew, uncertain how to explain what she'd witnessed, unsure whether anyone would believe her even if she tried. She completed her shift and returned to Friday Harbor, where she immediately checked with the terminal staff to see if another ferry had docked while she was making her run. No other vessels had arrived. The harbor had been empty all evening. Beatrice went home and spent the night staring at the ceiling, wondering if exhaustion or stress had caused her to hallucinate the entire encounter. But the phantom ferry appeared again. It happened 3 weeks later on another foggy night during another late run between the islands. The same vessel emerged from the mist. The same voice requested permission to dock. The same impossible sight unfolded before Beatrice's eyes. This time she attempted to photograph the phantom ferry with a camera she'd brought specifically for that purpose. But the images showed only fog and darkness. The Kalakala refused to be captured on film, as though it existed in a wavelength of reality that cameras couldn't detect. Over the following years, Beatrice encountered the phantom ferry 17 times. The sightings always occurred on foggy nights, usually during the winter months, always when she was making late runs with few passengers aboard. The pattern became familiar. Captain McKinnon would request permission to dock. Beatrice would grant clearance. The vessels would pass. The phantom ferry would fade into nothingness before reaching its destination. Beatrice began to recognize some of the passengers visible through the windows. A young woman in a red coat who always stood near the bow. An elderly man who sat in the forward cabin reading a newspaper. A little girl who pressed her face against the glass and waved with both hands. Beatrice eventually shared her experiences with other ferry operators, expecting skepticism or ridicule. Instead, she discovered she wasn't alone. Several other veteran operators had encountered the Kalakala over the years, though most were reluctant to discuss their sightings openly for fear of being thought mentally unstable. There was an unofficial understanding among those who worked the waters around the San Juan Islands. On certain nights, when the fog was thick and the sea was dark, Captain McKinnon still made his rounds, still attempting to complete that final Christmas Eve run, still trying to bring his passengers home to their families, still hoping that this time he would succeed where he'd failed in 1951. Beatrice tried to research the history of the sinking, hoping to understand why the phantom ferry continued to appear. She discovered that the Kalakala's final voyage had been unauthorized and desperate. Many of the passengers had been islanders who'd traveled to the mainland for Christmas shopping and celebrations. People who'd waited too long to return home and found themselves stranded when the regular ferry service was suspended due to deteriorating weather conditions. Captain McKinnon had taken pity on them, had agreed to make one final run despite warnings from his superiors and the Coast Guard that the crossing was too dangerous to attempt. The ferry had departed Seattle at 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve with 43 souls aboard, all of them eager to reach the San Juan Islands before Christmas morning. Witnesses on shore reported seeing the Kalakala's lights disappearing into the storm, heading north into waters that were being lashed by winds exceeding 50 miles per hour and waves that reached heights of 15 feet. The vessel never arrived at its destination. No distress call was ever received. No wreckage was ever found. The 43 passengers and crew simply vanished, leaving behind grieving families who spent Christmas Day waiting for loved ones who would never return. Beatrice came to believe that Captain McKinnon and his passengers were trapped in a kind of temporal loop, forever attempting to complete that fatal journey, forever hoping that this time they would succeed in reaching the islands and reuniting with their families. She began to feel profound sadness when the Phantom Ferry appeared, understanding she was witnessing not just a ghost ship, but a tragedy that replayed itself endlessly. A moment of desperate hope frozen in time and doomed to eternal repetition. On Beatrice's final night working for the ferry system before her retirement in 2003, the Phantom Kalakala appeared one last time. The fog was particularly thick that evening, and Beatrice was making her last run from Friday Harbor to Lopez Island. Captain McKinnon's voice came through the radio with its familiar request for permission to dock. Beatrice granted clearance, as she always did, but this time she added something to her transmission. She thanked Captain McKinnon for his service, for his dedication to bringing people home safely, for his refusal to abandon his passengers even in death. She told him she understood his burden, that she honored his commitment, and that she hoped he would someday find the peace that had eluded him for more than 50 years. There was a long pause before Captain McKinnon responded. When his voice came through the radio again, it sounded different, quieter, almost peaceful. He thanked Beatrice for her kindness and understanding. He said that perhaps it was time to stop trying, time to accept that some journeys cannot be completed, that some destinations remain forever out of reach. The Phantom Ferry passed Beatrice's vessel for the final time, and as it faded into the fog, Beatrice thought she saw the passengers waving goodbye, their faces no longer anxious but calm, as though they'd finally accepted where they were and what they had become. Beatrice never saw the Kalakala again, and as far as she knows, neither has anyone else. The Phantom Ferry has not been reported in Puget Sound waters since that night in 2003. Perhaps Captain McKinnon finally found a way to release his passengers from their endless journey. Perhaps they all moved on to whatever lies beyond the fog and darkness that had held them for so long. Or perhaps they're still out there, sailing through dimensions that most people never see, waiting for the right conditions and the right witness to make themselves visible once more.